So let's talk about the site where you put your company. You might worry about whether it's on a hill, in a valley with trees and such. If you usually want to trim all the stuff so nobody can walk close to the building without being detected by your security cameras. And you might worry about the utility reliability and the crime depending on your location. So you normally do not mark data centers. Any building where you don't actually want the public to come in, you don't mark it. I remember we worked at an old Bank of America building, and they took down the sign, but it still looked like a bank. And we were to a processing center where nobody should go in, but they sometimes people did come there looking for the bank. So anyway, if you share the building with other people or you're near other people, then their security measures might weaken yours, and your wireless networks might overlap. So that's a consideration. Your wiring closets must be secured because, of course, if someone goes in there and turns off the equipment or pulls out the cables, that will mess you up. Or they could also attach unauthorized devices and perform man-in-the-middle attacks that way. A demarc is the part of the network where the external network joins the internal network. So you pay your ISP, and they lay some kind of cable or fiber into your building or in somewhere near your building, and then there's a demarc where their responsibility ends, and the wiring from that point on is your responsibility. All right. And then server rooms, of course, you have to limit who goes in there, usually with things like security cameras or swipe cards to get in. And your server rooms, you need environmental control. You can't let it get too hot or too dry or too humid in there. So you also have media storage. You have to store your media off-site for your backups so that if the building burns down, you've got your backups. And you have to also have, this is also required often for legal proceedings and regulatory compliance where you have documents stored, and you have to protect them from unauthorized access, and you might need environmental controls. Things like magnetic tape can't be exposed to temperatures that's too high. All right, and then your system defenses. If people actually get physical access to your devices, then you may still have some defenses. For example, you can have asset tracking where you do an inventory and you know if some of your devices have gone missing. And you can restrict physical connections like your Ethernet ports or USB ports either by blocking them with glue or by implementing logical controls that will only let authorized devices in. All right, and then the environmental controls, of course, mainly applying to server rooms, but you have electrical faults of various kinds, and these are, of course, bad for electronics. So you can have a surge protector, which just stops big voltage spikes that would break the electronics. Uninterruptible power supplies contain a battery, so they'll continue to work even during an outage. And generators are what you have for long outages. So typically in a server room, you have UPS systems that give you maybe 20 minutes of power, and that gives enough time to start your generator. And that's how you keep the power going on for a long time. But of course, then you have to have fuel storage, and it's a fire hazard and things like that. But this is what you must do for 5-9 facilities and facilities that have to stay up like hospitals. EMI is radio generated by one wire or some other device leaking into the cable. This is a big problem. The data signal from one wire can leak into another. This is why you use all the cables for Ethernet are twisted pair, and each pair is twisted a different number of turns per inch so that the electronic signal leaking out from one into the other will tend to cancel out. Unshielded twisted pair is the cheapest and most common cable, but it's most susceptible to EMI. Shielded twisted pair just adds a layer of metal on the outside, so that protects it to a large extent from electromagnetic interference. Fiber optic cable is immune to electromagnetic interference because it's sending light, it's not sending electrical signals, so it's not going to be affected by any radio transmission from the outside. Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning is a big deal. You often use positive pressure, so the pressure inside your building is greater than outside, so it's pushing out when you open the door, and that tends to expel things like water. And your data center has to have a humidity around 50% and a temperature at a reasonable level. You can't let it get too warm or too dry or too wet. And if it gets too wet, it will cause corrosion. If it gets too dry, you'll have static electricity. Both of those are a hazard to your electronics. All right, that's talked about here. You can also use grounded circuits and wrist straps when you're working on things to prevent static shocks. And of course, dust is a bad thing. You can have contaminants that can cause overheating or short things out or cause corrosion. So you typically keep the dust out, and if you're working on sensitive things, you even have a clean room. All right, heat detectors are thermometers. They just have something like wax that will melt leaking out water, the simplest ones. Smoke detectors use some kind of ionization or photoelectric detection to determine if there's smoke in the air. And flame detectors look for the light from the flame. These are just various ways to know when to either turn on the sprinkler system or ring the fire alarm. And your people have to know how to evacuate. You have to have practice, evacuation procedures. And you have a safety warden and a meeting point leader to make sure that everybody leaves and that you count them and make sure they all got out. And if you have people that cannot use stairs, then you have to help them get out. And you have to avoid using elevators in a fire because they tend to go to the area that's on fire. No, this is the end of chapter 3. All right, and so emergency warning systems warn you about things like severe weather or somebody attacking the building or something like that. And then you have fire extinguishers. A is for ordinary combustibles like wood, so it's usually just water. Then you have B for flammable liquids, and C for electrical equipment, probably the most important for us, the kind of thing you'd use in a server room. Then D is for combustible metals, which I don't think is very common to find at all outside a chemistry lab. And K is for kitchen fires, like oil. So you need a special extinguisher for that. All right, so these all either reduce the temperature, reduce the oxygen, or reduce the fuel, or interfere with the chemical reaction in some way or other they put it out. So like I say, water is good for paper or wood, but not good for electric devices. Soda acid dry powder is what you use on a metal fire, and there's a wet chemical used for kitchen fires. CO2 is quite effective, but the problem is the people in the room can die from lack of oxygen. A halon is what people use, a special chemical that can suppress the fire without suffocating people. And it turned out to be bad for the ozone, so now they use these other chemicals instead of halon, but they have the same effect, that an amount of this that is not enough to suffocate people will stop a fire. What about dust and small fine particles? Yeah, that's why you would have filters on your servers, and you might have positive pressure to blow it out. Yeah, but keeping dust out of your servers is a good thing, of course. All right. And so you often have a countdown timer, some kind of warning before you deploy these things so people can evacuate, and also lets people turn it off in case of a false alarm. And sprinkler systems. There's a bunch of different ones. Wet pipe is the simplest. There's just water in there, and water will flow when it opens. A dry pipe is what you use if the water might freeze. And you have a deluge one that just dumps out a lot of water. And then there's pre-action with 2 triggers, a fire alarm and then heat at the sprinkler head, sort of thing you use where you don't want accidental discharge going off. All right, so let's try the last Kahoot. All right. Well, okay, I thought there might be a few more people coming in. Okay. All right, I guess this is it. All right, so where does the ISP's responsibility end? At the demarc, which might be in the server room or something, wiring closet, but it's wiring closet or pull, but that's called the demarc. Demarcation where the responsibility shifts from the ISP to the customer. All right, which one of these is important for disaster recovery? Yep, your offline backups, so you've got them even if the whole building burns down. All right, which cable is most susceptible to EMI? Yep, UTP, the cheapest and most common, unshielded twisted pair. All right, which fire extinguisher is just water? Or it can be just water. That's not, sometimes it isn't, but water would suffice. That's A, Class A, just to stop burning wood and paper. All right, what countermeasure would prevent EMI? Yep, fiber optics. Does not use electricity, so radio does not affect it. All right, that's toe. All right. A couple of new winners. No new winners. Good. All right. So, that's all the lecture for tonight.